Okay, hi everybody. I can see that people are joining, so I'll just give you a few seconds to get in the door, and then we'll get going. Okay, so hi, my name's Owen, and I'm an educational psychologist working in Bristol, and I'm gonna talk to you for the next half an hour or so about something called Prosocial. So thanks to Sarah and the team at Southend for inviting me on. I'm looking forward to speaking to you guys. So you're probably asking, what is Prosocial? So let me introduce it quickly before I introduce the aims for this session. So Prosocial is a group-based intervention aimed at improving group cohesion, functioning, effectiveness, and well-being. It's based on ideas from evolutionary science, acceptance and commitment therapy, and the work of the economist Elinor Ostrom. Prosocial allows groups to talk about the hard things, difficult topics that aren't usually discussed. So sometimes there's a pattern in groups where people stop showing up mentally or even physically sometimes when there's enough undiscussable things are built up to create that kind of tension and difficulty. And one of the aims of Prosocial is to give groups an opportunity to kind of bring that stuff into the room and tackle it head on and talk about it and make space for it, really. Another aim of Prosocial is to help a group clarify their purpose and clarify their shared values. And another aim is to balance individual interests, passions, and energy with collective interests. And this will all become a bit clearer as we get stuck into it. So the aims of today's session to introduce the Prosocial process or framework, to introduce multi-level selection, part of evolutionary theory, we'll get onto that, to introduce Elinor Ostrom's core design principles, to introduce acceptance and commitment therapy and the ACT-Life lens, to use as many acronyms as humanly possible, apparently, to give a couple of examples of Prosocial in action, to explore a slightly different way of EPs working with groups. So as a lot of you guys will know, the educational psychologist's role is really varied, and there's lots of different things that we do, which is one of the reasons why it's a great job. And working with groups, so I trained at Cardiff and we did a lot of work around group work, group dynamics, kind of system theory. It's always been an interest of mine, kind of group work, and Prosocial is just like another kind of option for that kind of work. I suppose it's a good framework for getting involved with sitting with a group and exploring what's going on for them. So first thing to introduce is the idea of evolution and multi-level selection. So this is one of the core kind of theoretical underpinnings of Prosocial. Multi-level selection is kind of a hotly debated area of kind of evolutionary science, and kind of lots of biologists are involved in this stuff, and loads of people talking about this stuff at the moment. And it argues that evolution happens at different levels. So it happens at the cellular level, it can happen at the level of the individual organism, and it can happen at the group level. And central to evolutionary theory in general is the big idea of variation, selection, and replication, which some of you will be familiar with already. Tricky thing sometimes to get your head around is sometimes can feel like counterintuitive, the way of thinking. But to illustrate, let's take a look at these three desert environments. So these are actual real deserts. One's golden sand, one has black sand, and one has white sand. And the question posed to you is, what color are the insects, birds, reptiles, and mammals that live in these deserts? It's not a trick question. The answer is golden, black, and white, respectively. So most of the creatures kind of match the environment. So what's happening here is that process of variation, selection, and replication. So there is natural variation in the color of these creatures. Those whose color happen to match the environment, match the sand, are less likely to get eaten by predators. more likely to survive and reproduce. So they're kind of selected by the environment. And then they're more likely to have offspring that are the same color as they are. The replication element. So you've got variation, selection, and replication. That's kind of core to evolutionary thinking and evolutionary theory. Multi-level selection theory posits that this mechanism is appropriate links to kind of groups, and it links in a couple of different ways at a couple of different levels. So at the level of individuals within a group, so individuals within a group can and do compete with each other, and at that level, selfishness is often rewarded and self-interested behavior is selected by the environment, essentially. What multi-level selection theory argues is that competition within group is kind of trumped by competition between groups. So as I said, this is tricky. So when you've got more than one group competing for the same resource, as has been the case through most of human history, you've got that between group competition. And in that situation, more cooperative groups outperform less cooperative groups, okay? So you might have variation in a group's collective behaviors, practices. Some of those, that variation leads to more cooperation, and that cooperation is selected for, then that more cooperative group is more likely to be successful, and the successful group is more likely to pass on their collective practices and behaviors to future groups. Okay, so you've got that, again, that core principle: variation, selection, replication. More cooperative groups are more successful. And this can be summarized in this quote at the bottom here. So in a group, selfish individuals beat altruistic individuals, but groups of altruistic individuals beat groups of selfish individuals. So the next question is, what does cooperation mean here? So this process of the environment selecting for behaviors that give the group the competitive edge seems to necessarily involve the balance of self-interest and the group's collective interest, and at times the suppression of self-interested behaviors which threaten to undermine the collective interest. So multi-level selection theory suggests variation in the behavior of practices of a group, and those behaviors and practices which lead to a balance between self-interest and collective interest are selected by the environment. So that's quite a powerful idea. And that leads us onto the work of Elinor Ostrom. So another kind of core theoretical underpinning of the prosocial practice framework. So Elinor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009, I think. And her work, she spent a long time, decades doing this work, and she studied how groups manage common pool resources. So things like grazing land, forests, irrigation water. And at the time she was working, conventional economic wisdom suggested that individuals, groups left to their own devices with a resource that was limited would take all that they could. They would be greedy until the resource is depleted. And this kind of thinking, reasoning, was used to justify the idea that you need top-down state control or the invisible hand of the market to make sure that these kind of resources are managed. So Elinor Ostrom, in her study, and she studied over 100 groups kind of managing these common pool resources, she noticed that yes, sometimes the resources were depleted, Sometimes groups weren't very good at managing their resources, but often, and more often than not really, groups are very good at developing collective practices to successfully share and manage common pool resources. And in studying these groups, you notice that there are similarities and underpinning principles coming out of the different groups, shared between the groups, that she was kind of beginning to think about and analyze and theorize about. And what she did was cluster these similarities and cluster these collective practices under 8 core design principles, which I'll run through with you in a second. So how does this link to what we were talking about a minute ago with multi-level selection? So David Sloan Wilson, one of the authors of Prosocial, he's also a biologist and interested in evolutionary theory and multi-level selection. He became acquainted and read Elinor Ostrom's work and came to the conclusion that this was multi-level selection in practice. So you've got these different settings, different environments, and groups over time kind of evolving similar collective practices and behaviors independently, like separate from each other. So and at the heart of each of them, this kind of balance between individual and collective interests. So he really saw like an overlap between these two and got very excited, and kind of that's where this kind of prosocial thing kind of began. So let's have a run through these 8 core design principles. So number 1, the successful groups, so the groups that functioned well, had clearly defined boundaries that made it clear they were a group, what the group was about, and who was a member. They had group practices that ensured that the members of the group experienced proportional equivalence between benefits and costs. So that phrase, proportional equivalence, is important here. So that doesn't mean that everyone in the group got the same amount and everything was spread out equally. It meant if you took on more of the costs and more of the responsibilities, you got more of the benefits, and vice versa. Number 3, there were collective choice arrangements in place, so that everybody affected by a decision had opportunity to contribute to making that decision. Number 4, there was monitoring, preferably by members themselves, so that lapses in agreed upon behaviors could be detected. And number 5, which is linked, there were graduated consequences applied within the group so that the lapses in agreed upon behaviors were corrected, gently at first, but with a capacity to escalate if necessary. And often it was gently at first, but the most extreme outcome was that a member was asked to leave the group, and that was quite common across these groups. Number 6, there were fast and fair conflict resolution mechanisms in place to resolve differences. Number 7, there was recognition of the rights to organize, so that group members had the authority to manage their own affairs without external interference. So the group, had a bit of elbow room to do their own thing and manage their own interests. And number 8, when these groups got bigger and systems became larger, there was polycentric governance. So what that means is that you had more than one group, that they split into subgroups, and then the subgroups related to each other using principles 1 to 7. So rather than a top-down hierarchy emerging between the groups, they use these principles that we just ran through to kind of manage the relationships between the subgroups. Okay, so we've got those core design principles, and this forms like the bulk of some of the stuff in Prosocial. And the authors of Prosocial looked at these design principles and began thinking about how they could perhaps be prescriptive rather than just descriptive. So how could we use these core design principles to help groups function more cooperatively and become more effective? So they knew that, it's not as easy as just telling groups, these are the core design principles, crack on. They knew, like we know, that behavior change is not that straightforward. So they turned to the psychologists. They turn to behavioral science and acceptance and commitment therapy to think about behavior change and how the two could work together to bring about change in groups and better functioning groups. So one of the first things we do in Prosocial is sit down with a group and get them to rank themselves on these 8 different core design principles, using this spoke diagram that you can see in front of you. We've been thinking about using this as a pre and post measure as well, but really it's a way of getting the group start thinking, and then we kind of turn this into data which we give back to the group. So they do this individually, but then we compile it and turn it into kind of bar chart data and give it back to them. And it's a starting point for discussion as well, and then decision making about what kind of core design principle they want to start thinking about and start working on. And that's not always the one that's rated the lowest. It might be that it's just the kind of priority for that group. Next thing we kind of tend to do in the early sessions is introduce acceptance and commitment therapy and start thinking about group members getting in touch with their own internal experience, because that's kind of important. If you can think about what's driving groups and how groups are functioning, what psychology is going on there, the first point is helping individuals think about their own psychology and their own internal experience. So what is ACT? So acceptance and commitment therapy is a third wave mindfulness-based behavioral therapy. At the individual level, it aims to enable individuals to look at their experience and recognize difficult thoughts and feelings that sometimes direct their behavior. And rather than always battle and attempt to change and repress these difficult thoughts and feelings, to try and work alongside them and kind of befriend them. And this involves developing a mindful relationship with one's internal experience. So yeah, we introduce ACT, we introduce some of the core processes and some of the techniques and technologies. We don't have time to go into all of that right now, but yeah, you can take a look at that. One thing that we will look at, and that we use extensively in Prosocial, is something called the life lens, or sometimes it's referred to as the ACT matrix. What this does is allows us to take a look at our experience and the different features of our experience, and kind of lay it out in a visual, really. So to take a look at. So this divides experience into 2 axes. On the vertical axis, at the top there, you've got inner thoughts and feelings, stuff people can't see. At the bottom, you've got outer actions, so things that people might be able to see you doing if they were with you. And then on the horizontal axis, we've got way and towards. So humans, like all organisms, tend to move towards things that they want more of and away from things that they want less of. And this is all about looking at these different dimensions of our experience and looking at what's driving us, what kind of elements are tied up with us moving towards the things that we value and want to be about, and what kind of elements of our experience are away moves. So us trying to avoid kind of aversive stimuli, avoid fearful things. And the ACT matrix or life lens gives us a chance to look at this and look at, are there things over here like self-protective avoidant behavior that is getting in the way of us doing the good stuff, doing the value stuff, moving towards what we want more of. So just quickly, I'll give you a quick example of how this works. So I pose myself the question, what matters most to me about being a parent? So I'm a parent, I've got a daughter, and I've got love and responsibility. Okay, and so that's the top right. And bottom right, if I was really living in line with the values in one, so love and responsibility, what would I be doing more or less of? So I'd be taking time to attune to my daughter's experience, entering into her world. I'll be sharing the chores and responsibility of being a parent evenly with my wife. Okay, and top left, what thoughts and feelings might hook me and get in the way of me moving towards one or two? And that might be, I'm too busy, I don't have time for this, I can't do this right now, stress. Okay, and then bottom left, what people see me doing if I was hooked by these difficult thoughts and feelings? Might be rushing around, looking stressed, being patient, saying, we need to hurry this up a little bit. So I find myself saying that a lot to my daughter. We need to hurry this up a little bit. We've got to get over here. We've got to get to this place. We've got to do this. Or I might be not doing household chores. So this is a way of me looking at my experience, thinking about some of the difficult thoughts and feelings that might come up, and thinking about how I could work alongside them to get to the bottom right stuff. Okay, so within groups, what we do is we find something that we want to talk about. It might be a core design principle that they want to work on. It might be another starting point, and we use a similar format. And normally what we ask them to do is start with an individual matrix. So we might look at the core design principle, such as what matters to us most as a team about our shared identity and purpose. We might do that on the individual level and say, what matters to me about our identity and purpose? So an individual matrix, and then we move on to doing a group matrix together. And it's similar questions. If I was really living in line with values, with these values, what would we do more or less of? What thoughts and feelings might show up and get in the way? What might people see as doing the same stuff? And what I haven't really mentioned is that this noticing circle in the middle, noticing the dimensions of our experience. And that's what this whole matrix activity is about, but also ACT in general. You've got this kind of distance between these elements, the values, the fears, the way towards, and in the middle, you're there kind of looking at this. You're recognizing your own internal experience or the experience of the group. And that kind of psychological distance, you know, we're developing like a mindful distance and a mindful relationship with that experience, rather than just living the experience in an unreflective way. Yeah, and this is an example from some work that we did with the Bristol EPS, and what this looks like. And Menti is a really great web application which you can use to populate this stuff, but people can do it on their own computers or phones or tablets, and it's anonymous and no one sees who's saying what. So it's a really good way of kind of getting self-disclosure going on without people being too uncomfortable. So this this process of doing a matrix, what it does is allows people's voices, the group's voices, it gets everyone's voices into the room. It gets them talking. It gets them to start thinking about their collective fears and avoidance strategies. And what they normally do is notice that there's similarities in that. And they're like, oh yeah, no, I think this as well. And I worry about that. And that really forms a kind of bond within the group. And then they start talking about shared values, and you know, often teams working together, they value similar stuff. You know, education, people work in education, they often don't do it just for the fun of it. They have values that are important to them, and they share that. And once they start talking about that, that really brings the group together. And how often do you actually get to do that in your day-to-day? So it's meaningful stuff, it's meaningful conversations, and it's quite lively as well, because your fears and your wishes, that's motivating stuff once you start getting into that. So yeah, it's often a pleasure to kind of witness. What else did I want to say? I think that's it. Yeah, and obviously the aim really is for individuals and groups to think about selecting behaviors based on their values and what they want to be about, rather than the part of them that is kind of shouting the loudest, which is often a fearful or anxious part of them, part of us. So you know, how can we recognize that, sit alongside that stuff, whilst at the same time working towards things that we want to be about. Okay, so just a couple of quick examples of some of the work we've been doing in Bristol towards using Prosocial. So it's new to us, it's new in general, but you know, we've been getting stuck into using it a bit. One thing that's been really it really helped us with, so at the beginning of COVID, when everyone was really stressed and fearful and like, what on earth is happening, we did this collective matrix activity. So Duncan, my colleague who got into the Prosocial stuff first, ran it with the EPS, and it was really useful at that point, recognizing that we were all dealing with the same stuff, we were all confused, we were all having trouble concentrating and actually doing a lot of work. We were all perhaps avoiding, certain things and just trying to get through the day. And what really helped was clarifying our values as well, what we want it to be about. So there's this mixture of kind of fear, but also like really wanting to help and really wanting to help communities and people in schools. And that really came out, and that was nice. That was supportive and kind of like regulating and helped steer the ship. And it led to some really, really creative and meaningful work. And one of the things that we did as an EPS was we had a little bit more time because we weren't going into schools so much, and we're doing slightly few AEHCs, or there's still quite a few. So we had some time to do these work groups that came out of this prosocial process, and some great stuff came out of that, like meeting in small teams and working on projects to do with kind of webinars and technology to reach people. Also, Melsa came out of that, or like definitely was afforded some time to kind of develop. So that's a mediated learning support system project that Mary Stanley Duke, my colleague, has been working on. Is going to come on in a couple of weeks, I think, and talk about that on this series. So yeah, Prosocial and the group matrix was really, really useful there. And that's the matrix that came from there. Another project that's been good that we've been working on, so Duncan Gillard and I have been working on this project with senior leadership team at MultiAcademy Trust. So several schools who are kind of linked together. This work was born out of discussions around student well-being with the senior leadership team. They're worried about some difficult relationships between staff and students. They wanted to kind of help those relationships, build some teams and some cooperation within those small groups. But they decided to start at the top, try and use Prosocial to work with the senior leadership team, help the senior leadership team's functioning, collaboration and well-being. And then hopefully that would, they could then cascade that down into their schools. And this group were great. They had maybe a bit skeptical at first, but as soon as we got into it, they started having these lively conversations. They really got involved. And one thing that again really came out for them at the beginning was amplifying these shared values and motivations. So their identity and what they're about, and some of this, the communities that they served, and difficult kind of social economic situations for lots of the families that they were working with and supporting, and that really clearly drove them as individuals, and giving them a chance to talk about that and connect again on that level, was really energizing. Another interesting thing that came out of that work was their focus on the first CDP that they chose to focus on, which was supporting and monitoring agreed upon behaviors. So this group, they're busy leaders, ambitious, lots of plate spinning, and it kind of came out that they were happy to put time and energy aside for collaborative work, for more values-based action, but as long as the whole team were doing it. So time was a precious resource in this situation. They could be getting on with their own department work, they could be having family time, they could be doing all kinds of stuff. They were all happy to commit to being more collaborative and working together on projects and sharing stuff together and doing more values-based work, but they just wanted to know that they were all doing it together, not just one of them. And I thought that was really interesting. And it made a good point about this prosocial process, that it's not that self-interest is bad and collective interest is good. It's all about the balancing the two. So, having a better work-life balance and having more time with your family, it's kind of self-interest, but it's not a bad thing, is it? It's a fantastic thing to have that balance. But within the context of the group, balancing that self-interest and collective interest is what it's all about. So again, it's like making space for those difficult conversations to happen, and time as well, obviously, with school staff, trying to make time for them to sit down and have those difficult conversations. But once it was working, you just step back and let it happen, and kind of smile, but you notice that there's that energy and that stuff going on. And like, oh yeah, this is kind of working. This is a good model. So that was really cool. Okay, final thoughts before I can answer any questions that you guys have. So theoretically, this stuff is fascinating. looking into multi-level selection and evolutionary theory, is something that is a wormhole you could get stuck in for a long time. It's practically energizing. It's a framework or process for exploring, exploration and creativity, having those difficult conversations about fears and passions that often have a lot of energy in them. It's working with complex systems with lots of variables going on, and within those complex systems, making room for variation in behavior, for difference, and for change, is an important thing. And this is one framework for trying to make stuff like that happen. Final thing to say is Duncan and I have been developing this 4-session protocol for work in schools. So Prosocial, isn't developed schools specifically. There's plenty of people working on it in schools, but we've put together this protocol that we've been working on that hopefully we'll be ready to share with people soon, so other people can kind of use that if they want to. Okay, so I'll open up the questions in a second. There's some resources there which I hope Sarah maybe can copy and paste into the chat, because you won't be able to copy them from here. And no, I can't either. Okay, I'll try and get them to you somehow. Some references at the bottom. Okay, so let's have a look at Q&A. Okay, I don't think we've got any questions. I can't see any questions in the Q&A. Let's have a look through the chat. No, I don't think we've got any. Okay, that's fine. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen to me. I hope you found that interesting. There's quite a lot to take in. If you want to know more, I would suggest going on Prosocial World, which is prosocial.world, I think is a website, but you can just Google Prosocial World, and there's tons of resources there as well. And there's also quite a few videos about the place. And then the book is called Prosocial, so Google that as well. And the book is actually really readable. It's not too dense. It's quite accessible. It goes into stuff more. Okay, cool. Thanks so much for listening. Take care.